Welcome to another very special episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. As always, I'm your host, Carl, and this time I am joined by my co-host, Peter. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
Never gets old.
Nope.
So, we've already teased this in the last couple of episodes. In our November episode, we went big with it. November 1979 was a historically very, very important event. Namely, the FCC changed its regulations in regards to computers. After this, we would have a completely different set of regulations setting out the standards that would govern what computer manufacturers could do and also set out some very important industry standards that in a large part are still with us or influencing us to this day. Now, because we are not experts on this topic, we went out of our way for you, our dear beloved listeners, to find somebody who did know this. And no, he didn't just send us an email telling us that we didn't know what the hell we were doing and correcting us at every step.
Not at all.
That would never happen to us because we're always correct. Oh, wait, I just thought, okay, no,
yeah,
not the President of the United States. Okay, whatever the case may be, we are very happy to welcome onto the show today a man that you may know online as QuarterPast38. We're just going to call him Dale. That's the alias the FBI told us was permissible. And he's calling us from a snow-covered northern wasteland.
Hi,
Welcome
guys.
to the show, QuarterPast.
Great to be with you. How are you?
It could be worse.
All right.
It can always be worse.
It can always
was-
be worse,
yeah.
man. But it can also always be better. But
Exactly.
right now we have a guest from Canada. So
So
welcome.
it can't really get any better.
Nope.
I'm glad you didn't completely oversell the intro, but
Oh, this is going to go on Patreon first. Those people have already paid their money.
that's true.
It's all good.
All right.
so-
Well, let's try and give money's worth. But I'm certainly glad you didn't try to label me with the expert label. I would have had to have jumped right in.
No. We just want to say that you are somebody like us who is interested in the history of the industry, who is interested in finding out what happened back in the day behind the scenes, and that your particular area of interest, the area that you've put a lot of time into researching, happens to be FCC regulations.
Yeah. No, is it expert enthusiast or enthusiastic expert? What is the term we should use nowadays?
No, you would be a expert enthusiast.
No, drop the expert. But
Okay.
anyway, but yeah, basically that's been my. I've been inspired by the thousands of people online who engage in the same thing. Really, a lot of the people that do great work in preservation, allowing people like me just to do research without ever having to get up off the couch. And so, yeah, in the last few years, I've taken a deep dive down the video game history rabbit hole, and about a year or so ago, I ran into the FCC story, and at first was very confused by it, and then spent a lot of time trying to unpack what exactly had happened.
And I'm really glad that you did the job, so I don't have to do it because it confuses me as well.
You
So,
might regret
thank you.
that later.
So,
We'll see.
remember, this isn't live. We can edit a lot of his meandering out.
Oh,
So-
there could be massive. We
You
need
were
like
talking
a
about my meandering, I guess.
No.
No?
I'm talking about his
Yeah?
and yours.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And yours? I know you're doing the editing, so
Exactly. I don't meander.
Dale,
I just,
we are in the last position.
I just like to give the proper tempo to the build-up of the nuggets of knowledge. That I
And
have
this needs to be cut out. Dale.
Okay. So,
Anyway.
Dale, let's get into the topic. Let's start with a very simple question. I know this one's going to be really quick and easy to do. What is the FCC?
Well,
Peter.
the FCC. Listen, the Federal Communications Commission. It's like a 12-syllable mouthful, and even when you're writing about it, usually you like open up a paragraph, you write the Federal Communications Commission once, put it in parentheses, FCC, and you never refer to it as the Federal Communications Commission again because it's a mouthful. But or sometimes when they flex, strangely, in their reports, they'll refer to themselves as the Commission, such as the Commission sees no merit in that argument. But otherwise, from this point forward, we will not refer to them again as the Federal Communications Commission. But to quickly unpack what that is, federal in this case, of course, refers to the federal government of the United States of America. And a warning to, I guess, any European people listening in, don't lose hope. Everything we're going to talk about has to do with United States law. But there's a significant deal of, I don't dare say the word in German company. What is the word where you enjoy the suffering of others?
Schadenfreude.
There you go. So yes, there's lots of that on its way. So don't lose hope just because we're talking about the United States. Communications in this case really refers to telecommunications. I'm guessing they didn't call it the Federal Telecommunications Commission because there was already a Federal Trade Commission. And the commission part of it refers to it being an agency, which we can get into if you'd like a quick civics lesson.
Keep it short.
For those of you who don't, well, it's basically it's a machine of government, if you will. So if you're a country and you want to print some money, maybe you'll make a Department of Money, or you might want to defend your borders, so you have a Department of War. And in the United States, of course, they have a Treasury and what they call a Department of Defense because they had to change the name Department of War.
Yeah.
But sometimes in the course of things, you might want to do something special as a republic, like maybe you want to go to the moon. So instead of having a Department of Go to the Moon, which would be silly because then once you went to the moon, you'd have a Department of Gone to the Moon. So instead you create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA, right? So that's an agency, and it works independently of the executive branch of the government from which it stems. Now, in the case of the FCC, they are what's called a regulatory agency, an independent regulatory agency. And they really should have been called the Federal Telecommunications Independent Regulatory Agency. Saddled them with that. But instead, they're the FCC. What an independent regulatory agency does is it reports only to the legislators, the Congress in the U.S., and so it's not controlled by the executive branch, the president. And that way it has an independence to act independently. A good example, or another example in the States, is the Federal Election Commission. So that way they can have an independent agency that helps control and keep their election process secure and safe. And it's a way that the government can have regulators without having to burden their policing agencies. And in this case, of course, it has to do with telecommunications. So that way you don't have to have the FBI all up in everybody's grill just because of radio interference. More for the smaller regulatory needs rather than actual crime.
Perfect.
And so that
was a good civics lesson.
There you go. So that's I want a Department of Go to the Moon.
Well, all you had to do was come down to us and be a few decades earlier. Because that stuff ain't happening anymore.
That's right. Oh, I wouldn't say that. We're going to Mars.
Yeah. Just right after we get fuel cell vehicles.
There may be no independent agency in the United States with better PR than NASA.
Oh, this is definitely true. I mean, you don't see a lot of people running around with FCC T-shirts.
Oh, the FCC could have taken a strong public relations lesson from the folks over at NASA. Anyway.
So now, okay, so we know what it is as far as an organization is concerned. Where does it come from?
Well, it's like a mega agency. It comes from, strangely, the New Deal and President Franklin Roosevelt. And not to get too mired in history, but there was a huge government reform action that happened somewhere starting around like 1933. And a whole bunch of different agencies at that point that were controlling different aspects of telecommunications. There was telegraph, telephone, radio had already emerged. And the FCC was basically a merger of all of these different agencies into one. But its core element for our purposes is its predecessor known as the Federal Radio Commission. And in order to explain the Federal Radio Commission, I'd like to try and compress the entire early part of radio history in 2 minutes.
Okay.
All right.
I don't think this is going to work, though.
We'll set the clock and
All right.
see how you do.
All right, well, Peter will have to pass the comprehension test afterwards. But basically, if we go all the way back... Okay, here we go. Go all the way back to the time that radio had moved from concept into practice, where people were actually being able to wirelessly communicate. It's primitive. It's crude. Think Fritz Lang, 2 antennas and a spark between 2 metal knobs kind of thing, right? That's why it's called wireless telegraph for its start. Now, the world had already had telegraph for an entire generation prior to this. The magic of the shrinking world, thanks to telegraph, had already happened. Weather reports had started to occur. People got yesterday's news in a newspaper. Now, for reasons completely unrelated to that, the United States had a terrible reputation in terms of regulating and legislating its early telecommunications, largely because only the Navy was one of the largest customers of this wireless technology. And even though it was super rude in 1910, let's say, it was totally legally permissible to send the U.S. Navy's armada off on a wild goose chase with an SOS prank. There was actually no legislation by which to stop that, because basically everyone was unlicensed. There were no licensed operators. So threatening to be uninvited to the next radio telecommunications conference, to which they still hadn't adopted the recommendations that were set out before it, the U.S. finally signs the Radio Act of 1912, and that becomes like their baseline legislation for this new wireless telegraphy. And in fact, they even had some stuff that was going to be brought up in the next conference. So they were sort of ahead of the game in 1912. But unfortunately, they relied on those laws for too long, because in the 1920s, something amazing happens, right? There's an explosion of radio thanks to the vacuum tube, or the audion. And I won't get into all that, but essentially what happens starting in about the 1920s is somebody figures out that a vacuum tube is a really awesome audio amplifier. And that through the development of a lot of different people and over a very short period of time, this radio technology develops voice fidelity, and good voice fidelity. Like, at this point, you have the phone, but the phone sucks. It sounds really bad. You have wax cylinder phonographs, and I suppose if you're really on the cutting edge, you've seen some shellac-based platters, but none of this stuff can sound like what is going to be brought on by electronic amplification. And one of the first places to develop that is in radio. Anyway, this thing explodes. This is like the final mile. We talk about the final mile in people's houses and how important it is to get the connection to the individual. I can't think of an instance where there was such an impact on everybody, because now you had all of this in your house. It wasn't just a weather report for the next day. There were 2 weather reports a day. The news was from that day. There were people singing songs and performing plays, and it was incredible. It was a revolution. And so obviously the demand for it mushrooms, right? And so the US government then tries to keep up. And essentially what they're doing is they're issuing licenses to radio operators through the Commerce Department, in a department interestingly run by Herbert Hoover, who will later go on to be president. Anyway, this thing is a mess. It's contentious, it's litigated, and ultimately it turns out that it's because they don't have any constitutional authority to do this written in. Basically, it was just written as, we'll license because we're the Commerce Department and we can license. Well, it only takes a couple of challenges, and then the unthinkable happens. And it's in April 1926, a judge basically vacates the entire Commerce Department's ability to regulate radio. And then all hell breaks loose. It's total chaos within reason of the fact that these are radio stations that now start jumping bands. And anyway, it goes on for 8 months. And this is at what is the peak of the golden age of radio at this point. So with all of that in mind, that I go on that ramble, because this is where the government had to come up with actual legislation. And for that, they came up with the Radio Act of 1927, which sounds a lot like the Radio Act of 1912, but actually gives them the constitutional justification. And for this, Carl, I can turn to you because I'm no lawologist. But you understand how somehow this gave them the constitutional authority through interstate communications.
Well, okay, and I will tell you one thing. Number one, just shy of 5 minutes, so
just
not
over
quite
150%.
Not your 2.5 minutes, but close.
Mm-hmm.
And what year did you say this law was? 1927.
27.
There you go. Peter passes.
See?
Oh, Peter passes. Okay,
I'm
paying
listening.
attention.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't looked at the law itself, but this is a period of time going into the Great Depression when the idea of the federal government actually having control over things is in its infancy. There's still a lot of battles to be fought here. There were attempts to make the federal government more powerful, but it's not really until the deep Depression when when FDR threatens to basically add so many new justices to the Supreme Court to invalidate the old conservative justices from the pre-Depression era, who had constantly been throwing his New Deal laws out as exceeding the power of the federal government. And it's a famous moment called the Compromise in Time that saved 9, where basically the Supreme Court suddenly from one day to the next decides, you know what? We had this all wrong. Of course the Commerce Clause in the Constitution says that you can do all this. Now, the Commerce Clause says that the federal government, and this is in the Constitution, in the original version, says that the federal government has authority over anything that goes between the states, anything of commercial value that goes between the states. This is where we get the interstate highway system paid by the federal government or co-financed by the federal government because it's aiding commerce between the states. If you have a road that only goes within one state, was previously not allowed to be touched by the federal government. A product produced in one state and consumed in that state, not part of, not controlled by the Commerce Clause. But if you're going from one state to the next, it is controlled by the Commerce Clause. So in this period of time in the 1920s, you had to prove in very, very great detail that you were truly talking about something that goes across state lines, which in the case of radio waves is obviously the case.
Right.
Unless, of course, you're
in the middle of the state.
In the middle of a very large state where you're not going to go across, then you might still have a constitutional bone to pick. Right. With any attempts at regulation.
But then you would have so many exemptions of some radio stations saying, hey, I'm in the middle of the state. No one outside the state can listen to me.
Yes and no. You have to remember radio waves can go fairly far, sure. And you have a ton of states that are small enough where you are going to have that problem.
Yeah, and if the onus was on the operator as well, it would be then it would put the legal cost on that person, that individual, trying to claim that their radio waves were only within state lines.
Exactly.
Which would be difficult.
That would be difficult. And ultimately, this is going to be a stopgap because anybody with that argument, once you get to the compromise in time, that argument disappears. Suddenly, the Supreme Court's going to allow all sorts of wider interpretations of the Commerce Clause.
Okay.
Peter, if I'm quizzed on that later, I'm probably going to fail.
Yeah, me as well.
But here's what I do know: basically the Radio Act of 27 starts this Federal Radio Commission that acts as librarians to hand out licenses. They can't write policy on the issue because really they're just set up to clean up this radio mess that had occurred from the law being vacated by a judge the year before. It takes them longer than a year. They're extended for 1 year, then they're extended for another year, then they're like quietly extended indefinitely. And that, in between there, by the way, the stock market crashes, and FDR also starts the New Deal and scoops everybody into this massive organization. But to that point, what our interest isn't so much in the telephone or the telegraph that will soon be dated, but how radio comes into conflict with the devices that we know and love. But yes, you that's basically even defined in the FCC's charter, that they are for the purpose of regulating interstate and foreign commerce in communication by wire and radio. So I guess anybody that's coming to the table to say, well, mine is either strictly intrastate or is not to do with commerce, the onus would be on them. And so they generally don't bother to fight the U.S. government in this case.
Yeah. And like I said, in the 1930s, suddenly FDR has so much power in the courts. Right. Because the situation is so dire, and you do have this feeling that unless the federal government does something, the individual states will never be able to recover, right. That this becomes a necessity.
Well, and in this case, too, the idea is that it's helpful for this communications industry because they're hamstrung by the fact that they can't create policy. And it's now late. We're getting into the late 30s. Shortwave radio has matured, and FM radio has just been invented. And if they don't start to get some policies on the go, then this stuff isn't going to get regulatory development assistance from the feds. So that leads us to what they started to do when they got together.
And what was it that they started to do when they got together?
I'm asking my own questions. Listen, you gave me the question list
I've ever done. It's awesome.
You set the questions up a week ago, so it was fairly easy.
Okay, this is true.
If you'd like to take the reins again, feel free.
No, please. Autopilot is an amazing thing.
Oh, yeah.
So, please. And as long as it doesn't turn into a 737 MAX, everything's okay.
Yeah, it works for me every episode of our podcast.
Nice. We've been through this before, and this is what worries me, because this is a sort of complex subject, and it's where they came across the idea of their first policy. One of their very first policies had to do with what they call low power communication devices. Because at this point, radio is basically blasting as loud as it can to cover as much range as it can, but there's a need for radio that's, not as far away as you can get. The walkie-talkie is not too far away at this point. And what they specifically are going, it's a weird thing that they're going after. It's actually like a college radio station that runs along the power wires that are just on the campus. It's kind of a neat idea. It came from Brown University, was huge in the 20s. And this is what the FCC is at first reacting to. But because they're regulators, they can't just make one rule. They have to make a regulatory policy that governs a whole bunch of stuff, right? Yeah. And so there's a whole hearing about this. And Ewell Jett was the name of the guy that came up, or is credited for this concept. And the concept was, you see, in the States, you've got places that are tightly urban packed, cities like Chicago and New York. And then you have the states like Wyoming and Idaho that have an extremely low population density, right?
Yeah.
So in order to get around this idea of how can we have a policy that allows us to apply the same policy to an extremely crowded urban area, but also this extremely vast rural area, especially like what if somebody on a ranch in Wyoming wants to be able to use a wireless radio for their own communications on their ranch. So the idea that they came up with was to do testing based on distance, right? So depending on what the frequency of the radio wave was, dictated how far away you would test. Make sense? All right. Makes sense, yeah. All right. And here's the formula that they came up with. And I have to share this because it's simple, it's elegant, and it's so nerdy that it has 3 Greek letters in it. It was that the signal cannot be 15 microvolts per meter at lambda over 2 pi. Oh, just listen. Okay. Lambda over 2 pi. How geeky is that? Anyway,
right. I think that Peter actually just understood that, which is making me very, very weird.
If you're me and you see that, you look around to see if anyone's watching, and then you take a look on the left-hand side of the page to see if there's a simple English tab or link. And then you click on that in the hopes that will explain it to you. And there was, and I can explain it to you. It's fairly straightforward. What it means is all of these radio frequencies have a wavelength, right? Depending on the frequency dictates the length of the wave. And so that's a way of figuring out how far away you should be from the device based on the frequency that you're testing. So in the case of really low frequencies, let's say like the early frequencies that they're working on for that radio that they're using, you would be very far away, hundreds of feet, in some cases miles if you're testing for extremely low frequencies. And if the frequency is much higher, you'll get closer and closer to the device for testing. Mm-hmm. All right, so that's a perfectly acceptable concept?
Yes.
Perfect. Now, all we have to do now is gather the concept of what they used for a unit. See, if you're measuring this interference, you're actually sort of measuring the radio frequencies that are flying around in the air, right? Mm-hmm. So imagine if we're at an FCC testing site and we have our test antenna and we're pointing it at the device and we're like, 3 or 4 feet away from it, whatever. The distance doesn't matter. Imagine at the end of our antenna is a 3-foot beach ball stuck onto without deflating, of course, but it's stuck onto the end of the antenna. That's the range. That's like a 1 meter around the end of that antenna. So what it's measuring is it's measuring all the RF that's sort of flying through that imaginary beach ball space, if that makes sense. Now, when we measure power in the air, we're going to measure it in volts. But in this case, we're actually picking up such a small amount of power that we're going to measure it in microvolts. Mm. So the formula that I read in the first place was 15 microvolts per meter at lambda over 2 pi. And so what that meant was 15 microvolts is an extremely tiny amount of power radiating through in fact, it's so tiny that when they made the rule in 1938, this is the myth that perpetuates about this, they made it because it was the lowest amount that they could detect. In reality, they couldn't even detect that much. So what it meant was that you would take your device, you hold up your antenna, and if the needle so much as moved, sorry?
Yeah, nothing. Okay, works.
I was almost breaking. If the needle so much as moves, you failed. And so to quantify that, they came up with 15 microvolts per meter. And nobody really knows exactly why, other than that it was a way of implementing a no tolerance policy against interference. Now, why would I go on for such length about that?
I'm
really
guessing
that made
this
sense?
is going to lead to a problem.
Oh.
Just a little one.
No, I
Not
just
too
found that
big of
an
a
interesting
one.
side tangent. It has nothing to do with video.
Oh, excellent. Okay, cool. I'm cool with that. So the real method and where it became a problem is when they decided that a donkey hearing it was really the measure to use, right?
That's correct. Yes. They measured it in donkeys.
As any good scientific experiment will tell you, donkey is the true measurement of an accurate reading.
Actually, these were measured in micro donkeys. They were
Micro donkeys. Wow.
A micro donkey, by the way, just in case you don't know, is a millionth of a donkey.
A millionth of a donkey.
That's
what
correct.
happens when you have 100 of them together? Does it become a Donkey Kong? Okay, that was terrible. That was terrible. I'm just going to back off. That's going in the file. Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Sorry. Please continue.
Oh, sure. Would you like to ask?
It's your job to save the show now, okay? It's all you. So we have this formula that is set so low that it's supposed to be a zero tolerance. So any little motion on their reading gadget in 1938 automatically says no go.
Correct.
Cool.
And the reason that we went over that at such length is because that formula will perpetuate all the way to the personal computer.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
the way that the FCC handled, because let's blow through 30 years here really quickly. Devices come and go. The FCC kind of regulates them in categories as they come and go. And over time, you'll see things like the low power communication devices we talked about. There'll be community antenna TV systems for people in urban buildings. Radio receivers get their own category. Field disturbance sensors. Medical equipment. So all this, and what happens is each time they come up with a new category, the default setting for what is interference or what should be the baseline level of interference always comes back to 15 microvolts at lambda over 2 pi. And they start there. And they do this throughout the 40s and the 50s and really right into the modern era. And don't really, because don't forget that when we're talking about interference cases so far, we're really talking, what they're used to is more about radio stations jamming the signals of other radio stations or having legal disputes over who owns a license to a radio station. As we get into this modern era, especially post-World War II and the advent of electronics, that's when the real interference starts.
Okay.
Anyway, so every time they seem to go back to the well, they always come back to this extremely low variable, which obviously, as you can tell, is going to come and bite us in the butt later when we get into computers, which are extremely high frequency.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we've got this situation. All the other products that come out after 1938, be it AM radios, FM radios, television sets, and so forth, the industries keep adapting to be able to meet this 1938 requirement, correct?
And they will change after time. They basically start there. And then as the procedure goes, as a rule's put in place, if it's seen as too restrictive, the FCC will then modify the restriction or relax the limits, for instance. They did that with television receivers and radio receivers. They started at this low level, but then shortly after they were brought to market and tested, the levels were then upped.
Okay.
It can measure it with interference. Now we have televisions, we have radios, and those are super important devices, right?
Yeah.
Radio and the television.
They basically get everybody used to sitting around staring at a screen all day, which will be a wonderful setup for the modern office job.
We've been working on this since the end of World War II.
Yeah.
But anyway, what the next stop in the FCC train is when they start to be able to deal with some of these modern technologies, because over the years they're realizing that they are getting these interference cases, right? At this point, like in 1966, they report that they have about 80 full-time resources that work towards tracing and eliminating interference complaints. And they expect that the following year is going to increase by like X number of %, right? So this is becoming an exhaustive tax on the FCC's resources, is to basically chase all these spot fires. That's essentially what they're doing as a regulator. Is they will take an individual's complaint, they'll pursue the complaint, and then they'll try and resolve the complaint. But the individuals are growing, and the use of electronic devices are growing, and they recognize that they're not going to scale. And in fact, there's a fun example where it was a popular one in late 1965 when the government was going to launch the Gemini 7 rocket. As part of their early space program. It was basically on the launch pad and was close to being scrubbed because they couldn't keep communication with the tower. And so NASA, being clever, goes out and figures out that it's actually this ignition system on a winch truck that's at another installation owned by a private company. Well, the only way the FCC has to stop that is to go out and get a court order and apply it to the construction company. Because essentially that's how they've had to deal with all of these individual all of these conflict resolutions to this point. So finally, in 1968, Congress gives them authority over RF devices, explicit authority, as opposed to what they had before, which was just implicit, right? Yeah. They would have to go fight with a judge. Now with this new section, basically no judge is going to deny it. It is written into code that they can control devices which interfere with radio reception based on their own rule-making process. Right. And that's essentially, so instead of going to the individual level, now they're going to finally get to be able to apply regulations and restrictions at the manufacturer and at the industry level.
Cool.
And so all that finally, try to see what the date is on it. We're in July 1968, and it won't be until 6 months later that the FCC actually starts its rulemaking procedure on this issue. And I'm going to continue to blather on just for a quick second because I need to explain how long an FCC regulation procedure can take. It takes forever. Like the Congress, think about this. Congress gives them jurisdiction to this in the summer. 6 months later, they produce a proposal that they're going to share with everybody to comment on and re-comment on concerning the regulations. And then they're going to take a while, gestate that information, and then they're going to come up with a final report that they're going to show everybody that then everybody can. So the reason for this process is not to, I'm not trying to mock it. If you're looking to destroy an industry, all you need to do is overregulate it with deadlines that are far too tight, and you'll cause mayhem in any industry that you're regulating. So obviously, in this case, just for the record, I believe it goes 5 years later before the actual enforcement of what the Congress had given them in the first place. And that's pretty tight. That's not a bad turnover in 5 years. So anyway, but to give you the sense, these congressional things or these regulatory rules can take a long time. And I preface that because as we're going to get into this one around 1979, it actually also takes a really long time.
And so, so we get the power in 68. It takes about 5 years. Now we're in the early 70s.
Yeah.
Is there any big technological change that's happening during this period that may create some new challenge for the FCC?
Oh, do you know what the new hotness is in 1969?
What's the new hotness in 69?
Oh, come on, guess.
Yes, that sounds way, way dirtier than it's meant to be. We're talking about the year 69.
Yes.
So,
yeah, that's
really? You went for that?
I know.
That joke.
Wow.
I was not going to leave that one on the table. I'm very sorry.
Oh,
sorry.
Nice. Peter, would you like to guess what the hotness was in 1970? That wasn't drug based.
Okay, by adding the drug base, I think you just fried his mind.
Completely off the rails. Okay, here we go. Take two. The hotness in 1970 was the electronic video recorder. There were probably about like 13 companies that were busy making video recording technology for your television. And this was exciting stuff. It meant that maybe you could acquire a Hollywood movie to watch on your own television. You could maybe set up a camera. The first ones were tethered to the TV itself, but you could take videos of, you in the living room and maybe send them to other people with the same device. And the third, no promises, but maybe someday you could tape what was being played on television and watch it later.
Jesus. Are you talking about the time shifting? Sorry, that's another issue for another time.
This blow your mind. You can watch TV now and you can watch the same thing later. Unthinkable.
And not have to wait for the rerun?
You can make the rerun happen right after.
Black magic, you say.
It is black magic. So you can understand why there were 13 companies. The reason I mentioned this is because for our purposes, and I don't think we've mentioned a video game yet, have we?
No,
this is radio. No. This is the Radio Newsroom Time Machine podcast.
This is a video game podcast, and we're
I meant to come on
we
the
haven't mentioned video
Newsroom. Well, it's also a time machine, so.
Oh.
Yeah. So okay.
My original conceit was to roll the time machine back to 1939, but I got there and the news headlines were they weren't very optimistic. So we went against that idea. So anyway, the the reason I mentioned this is that in the midst of this, if you had showed up at an electronics show in 1972, that would have been what you wanted to see, were these electronic video recorders and this weird TV game dot thing that Magnavox was working on was truly an exceptional standout, more than what was coming down the pipe in terms of these electronic video recorders. Now, the very first one to come to the door at the FCC with one of these recording devices was Motorola, and they filed a petition for on behalf of CBS Labs, who were also doing work on their device. And just for clarification, the FCC can make its own rules and they can post them. As an independent company, you can also petition the FCC for new regulations. And so here's the beauty of this. Here's the beauty of what happened in terms of the electronic video recorders. Motorola comes to the FCC and says, "Okay, listen, we're kind of pooched here because we can't pass your regulations." At this point, the FCC now has its strict enforcement is in place, right? We're into the early 70s, and you have to have equipment authorization. You have to be approved now by the FCC. It used to be voluntary. Now you have to do it. So Motorola is not stupid about this. They come in advance and they confess right up to the FCC and say, "Look, we can't pass this 15 microvolt regulation that you've got. It's for our restricted radiation device, this is what this is classified under. We currently can't meet these regulations. We're asking you to make a new rule for something we can connect to a television and relax the emission rules." And they left it with the FCC. So the FCC takes this into contemplation and thinks, okay, obviously there's a dozen of these things that are coming down the pipe. We need a rule for things that connect to televisions, right? About 3 months later, Motorola gets back to the FCC and says, "Oh, hey, we fixed the problem. Yeah, we figured it out. We can now pass this RRD, this restricted radiation device test. We could pass that now if we needed to." Well, the FCC in its wisdom didn't really care so much. They were already busy making the regulation. So in July of 1971, they drop a proposal on the table that not only has the old faithful 15 microvolt regulation in it, but it has more restrictions, because what the FCC has realized is that, oh my God, you're connecting this to a TV. And I'm not an expert in this, and I've tried to educate myself in it, but as near as I can figure, there are two types of radio wave interference that we're going to talk about here. Mm-hmm. One of it is radiated, right? That means it just splays out into the air, into space, and goes everywhere, right? Yeah. There is also conducted radio emissions, obviously. For instance, and I didn't realize this, that your gaming system will push some of those RF frequencies right back into the local power supply. Or perhaps it will take the signal on your TV and shove it right back up the antenna, thus creating a broadcast of whatever you're trying to play on your television if you have one of these ungrounded electronic video recorders, right? So the FCC drops this new rule in everybody's lap and says, okay, not only are you going to have the radiation interference laws, but now you're going to be looking at things like output terminal conducted interference, line conducted interference, and RF output voltage.
Well, that backfired.
Yeah, exactly. And so everybody freaks out, naturally. And here's the hilarious, it gets better. They all start freaking out about this RF output voltage thing, which is kind of how much voltage is exposed to the. Do you know the way an old TV works?
You turn it on?
You turn the TV on. Can we take a quick second to talk about cathode ray televisions?
Of course.
Sure.
Peter, you're a millennial. Have you ever owned a cathode ray television?
It's a thing with the tube. It's not a flat one.
Those big ass, honking, gorgeous televisions that don't exist anymore.
Yeah, with the electronic, the electro röhre.
Yeah, the cathode ray tube.
That thing.
Yeah. There you go. Perfect. Exactly. Expert, really. I'm glad I came. On the back of an old style TV, at least in America, and in my experience, you had exactly one way to connect to this thing, right? There were two screws in the back of it that you would essentially have to, and by the way, if you didn't turn the TV off, you learned quickly to turn the TV off before you mess with this thing. But undo the screws, and there would be these little clips. They would look like flattened fork, tiny little flattened forks with all the tines in the middle removed. And you would take these spaded little shovel things and shove them under each of the screws and then tighten the screws back up. That was
I'm used to like more modern TVs, even
Exactly.
the one with the thing, you just put in a cable and that's it.
Right.
And
exactly.
you're good to go.
And that came into play in the late 70s with the advent of cable in the US. But prior to really all TVs from 40s on had these two infuriating little screw clips that you use to connect to the television. That's what you connected the aerial to the TV. So the only way that you were going to connect anything to a television was through those two screws, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the irony. So the irony is that they produced this proposal and they say, look, you're going to have to pay attention to all these different things, all this conducted radiation, all this the normal radiated emissions that are going on as well, and all of the manufacturers that are involved in this freak out about the RF output voltage. So the FCC takes all this under consideration. Like you're talking about companies like Motorola and RCA and Warwick, and they have this big fight over the RF voltage, which the FCC finally changes. But here's the beauty, and this is I'm killing the punchline here, but when they get to this notice and they ask for commentary about the rules that they've made, nobody mentions the radiated emissions. They're also concerned about the new regulations that they put on, that nobody has paid any attention to the fact that this 15 microvolts at lambda over 2 pi is still the radiated emission level. And so it passes. And that becomes the rule for what's known as a Class 1 TV device.
Okay. Now, is it possible that they just didn't pay attention to it because, like
They
you
didn't
said,
want to.
Motorola had already fixed the problem?
That's a fine question. I don't know. I suspect because it may have been somewhere between. Motorola had the problem fixed. They knew that shielding was probably the issue in that case. The electronics in this aren't running at a terribly high frequency, I don't think. So it strikes me that it was a fixable thing. These radiated emissions were a fixable thing. It was these new regulations that took everybody by surprise. That took up the major portion of the rulemaking process. And by the time the rule was finally finalized as a Class 1 TV device in 1972, it still contains this extremely restrictive radiation limit from 1938.
Oh, okay.
And the Class 1 TV device, to finally get to the point, is under which all video games will be covered because they will connect to a TV. The initial consoles, that is.
And just since we are in the age of the Magnavox Odyssey at this point, did that have to undergo FCC approval before it was released?
And how? And Ralph Baer will, I think you could certainly read about it in his books. Ralph Baer was, I think they were very irritated because I'm not sure exactly when the Odyssey comes to the FCC. It should be about the middle of 1972. April was my guess. And for all of Ralph Baer's fastidious records, I couldn't find it in there for the ones that I had access to. It's actually a guy named George Kent who works for Sanders that ends up taking it to the FCC. There is a strange story to maybe clear up, because I can tell you that Ralph tells the story about how this George Kent gentleman basically created an isolation switch, the Game TV box that's so famous in the back of a television.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with those?
Oh, of course.
Okay, you are, but Peter, do you know about a Game TV switch?
I actually just showed him a picture of it, but it gives a quick description for the newbies.
Well, that's what you're going to put on the back of those screws in the TV.
Okay.
Because that way otherwise you can't take your antenna off every time you need to play your video game. Right. It's silly. So you plug the antenna into the little box. The box hooks to the TV, and it has an isolation switch that you move back and forth, and you turn it one way, of course, and it will signal the game. other way to the TV. The strange thing about the story is that Baer accredits the invention of that to George Kent, but there is a record of an isolation switch that exists 2 years before with the Motorola and CBS Labs device.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just
well, right,
I'm just,
because with a
I'm just
video
here-
player would have the same problem, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, well, there was one, what was it? One of the ones later gets around it by just basically jacking the signal when you turn it on. It didn't have a box. It just took over. It just took over the signal when and you ran the antenna through the game system itself. They tried a lot of different things at this point, but understand like what that meant when you had to go through this testing. And we should I should mention a couple of quick things here. There's 3 types of testing, right? There's one called certification. Certification is the easiest type of testing. You, the manufacturer, are going to test your own stuff. You're going to take your records and you're going to submit them to the FCC. They review the records. They send you back a certificate. It's largely done for stuff that's easy to certify, like television receivers and radio receivers. There's another type that's harder called type acceptance. And in type acceptance, you have to go out to a lab, you get all the measurements done, you send them to the FCC for an audit. They take a while to audit it, then they send you your type acceptance. The worst kind is what's called type approval. And in type approval is the one that everyone's familiar with, in which you basically put the package in a box, send it to the FCC, get down on your knees and pray. Like I haven't seen this. They don't discuss this much, but generally it's implied in every production cycle that there's this gap that has happened. And this applies to like all of the video games that are coming. Think about it. You have a product that's electronic. You've designed it. You've got your final product design. And now you have to stop. You can't manufacture. And you have an indeterminate amount of period to wait and see if you have a binary approval or not. And God help you if you don't, because then you have redesign, cost, refitting for your factory, and another test in the hopes that it works out. So you can see why this becomes this major headache for everybody who's about to go down this process, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And especially in a fast-moving business like computer electronics.
Oh, you're jumping ahead of the game. They're doomed.
Yeah.
Dude, I'm taking so long here, we haven't even hit the microprocessor yet. God help us.
Okay, so we've got all this testing going on. Right. We have a category of device that hooks to a television set, thanks to the video recorders of the late 60s, early 70s. And we've got home gaming consoles on the horizon.
That is correct.
Now, what becomes a problem for the FCC first? Home microcomputers or home game consoles?
You know, we didn't set this up, because if we did, I'd have written it that way so that you would have guessed the 2 wrong answers, and then I could have gone, well, Carl, let me tell you. To me, this is the best part of the story, and I'm finally glad we're here. It's the original video games, of course, coin operated.
Oh, okay.
That's right.
I
So
stand corrected.
Way back in 1974, on a, let's call it a stormy night, a trooper for the Oregon State Police was on a routine call in Salem, small city, about an hour south of Portland, population 70,000. He tries to radio headquarters, and his signal's jammed. Now, I don't know exactly what happens to that one guy, but this happens fairly frequently. So much so, at least, that the police start making reports about it, and then they bring it to the attention of the FCC. Because, of course, you know, these are police. They don't want their radio frequencies being jammed. They might think some bad guy is doing it. So this goes on for quite some time, long enough that the FCC dispatches its field agents to find out what's going on. Now, field testing for intermittent problems is hard, right? When you're there to test a problem, if the problem's not happening, well, what are you going to do? Yeah, exactly. So basically, when you're diagnosing these intermittent problems, then if you can't get anything, the best you could do is start looking for patterns of occurrence, which is kind of what they did. And at least at the Nevada location, because this had occurred in Oregon, and the FCC by this point had also pieced together that similar things were occurring in Nevada. And strangely, in Nevada, it stopped at 2 a.m.
Okay.
And they couldn't quite put their finger on it. I know. We know the story because I already gave away the punch. But it wasn't long before this case was cracked, and they found out that, in fact, it was an Atari video game at a bar. And at the end of the night, the owner would unplug the game, and the radio would stop being jammed. Well, they were pleased with themselves. They found the problem. They went to the store owner, informed him, and as the story goes, the store owner had the distributor remove the game, and he moved it to a different location. Well, way to piss off the regulators, Atari. And and they write about it. They talk about the hours of wasted field investigation to have to go chase down that very same machine sometime in the near future. They actually, in their report, they don't nail Atari. They're sort of good at not naming names, which is unfortunate for the historian. But Nolan Bushnell confesses this way back in Stephen Kent's Ultimate History of Video Games book, where he claims that they had gotten in trouble with the FCC. I'm dying to know what game it is. I can only, like, these reports, there's a funny story about the reports in that they seem to creep back to 1974. They're definitely from 1975, and that is quite early in the Atari story. I mean, these are some crappy Atari coin-ops made long before Atari is purchased by Warner. And anyway, but understand the coin-op industry for what it was, the video game coin-op industry in 1974, 1975 for what it was, had no sense whatsoever of compliance, because as far as they were concerned, the only thing that they had to deal with was a television, and they were already purchasing the television, and it came pre-compliant by virtue of being manufactured by somebody else, right? And Atari didn't make the TV. It was a Zenith TV or whatever it was. And so Zenith had the TV compliant, and the coin-op manufacturers thought nothing of compliance for the FCC. So I'll put a thumbtack in that, because that really sticks in the FCC's craw and is going to come back to haunt them several times.
Okay. We will remember that.
But that was the sidebar for coin-op. But we can go back now to the first generation consoles.
Of course, and we're back at consoles.
How you making out, Peter?
Not too bad.
All right, you good? You good so far?
Yeah, I'm good so far.
I was worried about losing the audience at this point. There was a lot of math. We had to cut out a lot of math.
No, I think it's really interesting. It's for me, of course, since there's, well, the distance and the time is so, I really have to picture it to emotionally be there. You know what I mean?
I'll sit you down and we'll watch Smokey and the Bandit, and then you'll have all the imagery you need for this.
Oh, he's practically stealing stuff from the next page. If you think that Citizen Band Radio is not making an appearance in this story, I'm not sure where your head is. All right.
Okay, keep going. Let's do this.
All right. So anyway, all of these first generation consoles go through this crap, right? These are class 1 TV devices. They have all these restrictive conducted radiation emission limits. They've got this crazy 15 microvolt limit still attached to them. And every single one of them has to be type approved through the FCC. And so all of these games, and there's an explosion of these things starting in like 1975, 1976, right? Yeah. The home Pong machines. It starts with Atari. Some people make their own designs. It really explodes when Pong on a chip becomes available from manufacturers like Texas Instruments and Moss Technology and General Instruments. And literally, as a manufacturer, you can buy the chip, create the plastic box, stick some controllers on it, and with enough electronic knowledge, you have a first generation console. And honestly, there were probably 100 of these things created?
At least,
like
yeah.
101 Pong clones. And God only knows how many of them fell to the graveyard of the FCC. Whether or not they even would not pass, one of the common stories is that, for instance, they can get killed by the testing procedure. Allied Leisure, who was a company that was probably the most successful Pong company, even more so than Atari in the coin-op field, also sought to produce a home machine, and they had a machine that failed compliance and broke their, I think it was 76 Christmas. Yeah, they wanted to have been compliant by like October of 76, and basically found themselves with no time to ship for Christmas and thousands of these unsellable machines in 1977. And then, of course, I mean, you've seen the ball and paddle machines, of course, Peter. You know what I'm talking about there. The first generation Pong console.
And every producer of one of those clones had to send in their tech to the FCC in order to get approval. Every one of them.
I have to think that there had to be some hackneyed place that was carving like a few thousand of these things out to sell in some local place that they just never bothered with the FCC. That's right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but for the most part,
somebody tried it. Yeah, but but if you got caught, that was going to be a problem.
Well, one of the biggest stories is the one that comes back from Ralph Baer as well, and that is his salvation of the Coleco Telstar, which was the biggest selling of the first generation consoles. Are you familiar with that, the Baer story?
I've read his book, and I also saw him actually live at his first public appearance at the 1999 Retro Gaming Expo in Las Vegas.
Ooh!
I actually got to touch the brown box, the original.
No way!
I touched the brown box.
Your greasy skin oil is on the brown box now?
It is somewhere on the brown box, yeah. Ooh. It was a very, very weird experience. He's up there, he's telling us all of this, and I mean, and then afterwards he's showing us the brown box. He's like, this is the original brown box. He hooks it up to a TV. And at the end, I'm walking up there, and I was like, can I touch it? He's like, sure, and I touched it. So, yeah. It was basically like touching the Holy Grail and the Maltese Falcon all at once or something.
This is how it felt.
Do you know where that thing's been? Okay. That thing's been to court.
I know. Many, many times. many, many times. I've read his book. I mean, he loves to talk about his court appearances.
He does. Book. Ralph Baer loves to tell a story where the hero of the story is Ralph Baer. That's right.
Yeah. He's got a little bit of an ego going on there.
And in this story, the way it goes is Coleco calls up Sanders Associates in an absolute panic on a Tuesday morning because on Monday, the day before, they had failed FCC compliance. And according to Ralph in the story, and apparently this is a rare thing where you would ever get a do-over, but there are times that you can make arrangements for a second compliance test. From what I understand, it's fairly unusual. But anyway, Coleco's in deep crap. They've only got until Friday, apparently, to have their Telstar product fixed. And so they turn to Ralph. Well, Ralph and his crack team start on the product. And as the story goes, Thursday morning, Ralph comes into the lab and sees these iron circles sitting on the desks and asks somebody else about them, and they're actually these ferrite toroids that act as inductive chokes, and he wraps the wire through them, and the problem is solved. And the Telstar goes on to sell 1 million units, and everyone is happy. The end. No, but that's Baer's version of the story, and I'm sure that there's some simplification and exaggeration to it, as I'm sure that there's a huge element of truth to the fact that Coleco was at a point where they were chancing being the next Allied Leisure in terms of going into the first generation console market and getting smoked by a regulator and missing a Christmas. Because it was Coleco's timing, and also the fact that they had managed to get this order of chips with knowledge through Ralph Baer that had allowed them to be in the position in 1976 to sell the stuff. There was a huge boom in 1976. If you didn't make the market in 76, you weren't going to get the same benefit in 77. And if you showed up with a ball and paddle game in 1978, we were going to laugh at you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was moving fast, and the ball and paddle fad was going to pass.
That ship sailed. The second generation consoles all go through the same thing, and they go through it worse because, of course, they show up with a microprocessor. And the FCC, practically wets their pants, right? Here's a microprocessor. And Oh, and one more thing I did forget to mention about the Odyssey is that the FCC has a clause in their testing procedures, which were kind of vaguely defined at this point, but it allowed them to quote unquote maximize the radiated interference. For most devices, there wasn't much to do to maximize the radiated interference. Maybe you'd play the tape that your VCR had or something like that, or you'd turn the walkie-talkies on. But when they ran across a video game console with 2 connected controllers, they went nuts.
Oh, shit, yeah.
The field engineers didn't know what to do with them. So what they're doing is they're basically taking the controllers and they're moving them in a radiated pattern around the device, maybe crisscrossing them, maybe trying to basically increase in ways that unless you were playing your game behind the television, you and your opponent are wrapped up together in a coil type of pattern. And this is what they were doing. And so naturally the manufacturers started to catch wind that to them, they were knuckleheads. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of great stories that come out of it for the second generation consoles, specifically a guy by the name of Jerry Lawson. Are you familiar with Jerry Lawson?
Name rings a bell, but you're going to have to catch me up.
Jerry was the force behind the Fairchild Channel F.
Oh, yes.
Fairchild Semiconductor. He is a character. He's renowned. He's passed now, and he was one of the very few African American engineers. And his stories are absolutely awesome to listen to. Also, they're extremely exaggerated, and so. But Jerry, his complaint over trying to get the Channel F, which I believe it had failed on at least a couple of occasions, if I have that correct, and they had a terrible time trying to get that through. And it was actually a interview with Jerry that had led me down this whole deep rabbit hole. And he reads this quote. He's talking about the Channel F and the FCC regulations, and he's angry about it years later. He says, I'm quoting, "The problem was Texas Instruments. Years later, they couldn't make that spec, so guess what they did? They lobbied and got them to change the law. I was so mad I couldn't see straight, because that's what was keeping a lot of people from jumping into the market, including RCA. They couldn't pass the test." And so, in essence, and now Fairchild did pass the test. RCA, for their benefit, actually, the guy who was behind the RCA Studio 2, which is a reasonably obscure second-generation console. Are you familiar with that one?
No, never heard of it. I know RCA was in the microcomputer with little demo thing with hexadecimal codes, but no, I didn't know they got into the console business.
This was the offshoot of this, and they were still in a position where the controllers were attached to the unit itself.
Okay.
One of the things I also didn't mention, we mentioned the controllers, but that I believe must have affected some design choices. If you go back and look at a lot of those early first generation consoles, the early stuff you'll see, even Atari's Home Pong, you can't detach the controllers.
The Telstar either. The Telstar was also built-in controllers.
That's right. You and your brother are going to sit next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, and play some Pong. You stink. Yeah, whatever. So, but there had to have been maybe cost decisions were involved in it, but I can't imagine that it wasn't a regulatory decision that led anybody to go, we should put the controller just on the thing. Isn't it better that way? No, it's not. But the RCA Studio 2 did it that way. And it was funny because they did this crazy thing where, and the only other time I've seen this, I think, is the Atari 5200, where the power supply was run through the TV box. Okay. So there's only one. So what that did was it basically allowed you to move the unit to your couch because you didn't have detachable controllers. You needed to have this really long, like 12-foot cord out. So the FCC gets the RCA Studio 2 into the field to test it. And according to the engineer who was there at the time, Dave Callahan, he claims that the FCC took the RF cord and folded it into what you would call a folded dipole antenna. Now, you don't really need to know what that is, but basically what you need to know is that the engineers at the FCC at this point were taking the wiring and attempting to make them into receiving antennas to blow the test. I mean, now, to be fair, like I said, from their own mandate, they were there to increase to increase the maximum potential for interference.
And that they did.
But they pissed everybody off.
Mm.
Except for Atari, for some reason, who somehow managed to once again dance through the raindrops. Atari owes a debt of gratitude to a gentleman by the name of Tom Quinn, who was the Sears sports representative who hooked them up, I'm guessing, with Warwick Electronics. Because the one thing I can't find are Atari problems for home Pong or for the VCS. And so it stupefies me that those two devices marched straight through FCC without problem. And especially when you consider what state Atari was in 1975, or even really before the launch of the VCS, right?
Well, I mean, it's the VCS alone because, number one, you've got controllers you can plug in. So you've got open ports. You've got relatively long cables and everything else. I mean, it looks like it's going to be the device that fails.
Yep.
So it doesn't fail because the guy from Sears knows somebody?
Well, they certainly provided them with everything they seemed to need to not be hampered by the situation. They were first to market with Home Pong, and the more you look at it, the VCS's launch at Christmas of '77 is actually really early in the process. A couple of those ones we just mentioned were the very first ones. I believe the Studio 2 and the Channel F do beat. I know the Channel F beats the VCS to market. I think the Studio 2 does as well.
But was the Studio 2 was not a programmable cartridge system, was it?
It was.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's its own thing. I only bring that up because that was an example of what you would hear from people, and that was maybe one of the worst examples, particularly in RCA's case, because that cord that they were folding on RCA was also carrying all the power in this thing, right?
Yeah.
So it certainly didn't help. But that takes care of pretty much. That's what all of our first generation, all of our second generation consoles go through. And in theory, what all of those first computers should go through, right?
You'd think if they plugged into a TV.
If they plugged, well, this is the thing, I guess. Well, can we talk about that for a moment? Because this really confused me, but I think I got it figured out. Do you know what an RF modulator is? See,
I believe we need an explanation here.
Yeah, because I looked at it. I always thought it was that damn switch box. Well, you plug it into the television, you game, TV. Well, it turns out that's actually just the switch box. And the thing that can get really confusing about this is, what is the RF modulator? So to briefly set the framework, if you're going to set out video through a board, you could basically do that through composite video, and that will allow you to only plug it in using a monitor. Monitors don't really exist in 1976, 1977, right? Mm-hmm. There's no such thing. There's only TVs. So in essence, you're right. The entire Trinity gets away with being sold non-compliant because they're not going to connect to a TV. The PET includes its own TV in this giant sarcophagus under which it's built. The TRS-80 never met compliance, but understand that in order to sell the computer, you had to sell it with a television. And the TRS-80 sells like for, I forget what it is, but it's around $700 to $800 in 77 money with the monitor.
Yeah.
The monitor adds an enormous amount of expense to the product. Mm-hmm. But the Apple II didn't have a monitor. Well, I guess you could purchase a monitor with it, but the Apple II came to market under very exceptional circumstances where it was really never meant to be plugged into a TV because it actually had no RF modulator in it. I guess what I'm confusing here is there's conflation, at least in my mind, between that switch box on the back of the TV and what is the actual RF modulation. All of those consoles, first and second generation that we're plugging in, all had, and if you crack them open, you'll usually see it. It's a silver box, like an aluminum encased box inside of it. And that's the circuitry that's basically taking whatever the video signal that the computer is making, this composite video, and it's going to modulate it. It's going to change it and basically pretend that it's a television aerial frequency, right? And that way, when you plug that thing into the back of this stupid 2-screw thing in the back of this old TV, the only thing that those 2 screws know is that they're an antenna. So in essence, the RF modulator inside of that box is going to fake the aerial signal, and that's how you're going to be able to play it on your TV.
Yeah.
If you don't have that RF modulation inside of the computer, you have to really then go out of your way in order to make that happen. And in 1977, they basically didn't exist. Well, they did, but they were rather hard to come by. And Apple made a decision early on to just abandon it. I'm not exactly. I wish I had the name of the gentleman in front of me, because he's the one that comes to them. It's a story told in Steve Levy's Hackers, and they basically come to them and say, "Look, we can't make the RF modulator work. We're essentially going to have to leave it off the board and sell this, so you can't connect it to a TV." And I'm surprised there is from Steve Levy's telling of the story, because it's the Hackers book. These guys are almost like Robin Hoods outfoxing the evil regulator, right? And so the story goes, they give the spec for their RF modulator to a guy named Marty Spergel, who creates the Super Mod. And if you go back and look at the old Apple II manuals, there's 2 or 3 pages about, like, here's what you're going to have to go through to hook this up to the TV. And in most cases, it involves a soldering iron. Like there's really, like, you have like 4 options. 3 of them involve a soldering iron, and they're not complete. And one of them is this product sold by Spergel and his company. I believe it's is it M&R? The thing is called the Super Mod, and essentially Apple is coaching you through this in 1977 to say, look, you're going to need to send $29 to these guys, and they'll send you the RF modulator.
Nice.
And the Apple II sells like this for, well, Spergel claims that he had sold 400,000 of these things. I don't know that that's exactly right, but and that's how Apple got around FCC regulation. And they knew that when they recreated the 2 Plus, which I think is the next in the line in the 2 series. But for the course that the Apple II ran, that was one of its huge hurdles, was that the thing's already a $1,200 1977 computer. Now you need to go buy a $400 color television or a color monitor, and good luck with how much a composite monitor costs in 1977.
Exactly.
If you can find one. So it was and there's some serious reason for why the Apple was a little bit hamstrung in those early years. The TRS gets away with it, and in some ways I think they were actually playing fast and loose as well, because they had the retail outlet where, instead of having to have a note in the computer box that talked about RF modulators, the handy tandy radio salesman could be there to explain to you why you could save $200 off of your purchase by not buying the monitor and buying one of these RF modulators. But anyway,
so,
and that's okay.
Just for me to sum it up, as long as you do not have a RF modulator on your system, the FCC is not responsible for you.
In 1977, 1978, yes. Right. And also you then have a whole lot of trouble mass marketing this to a wider audience, because putting that hurdle in the way is, it will stop it by an order of a magnitude. And the sales bear that out. These computers don't sell 1 million units. The Telstar sold 1 million units, because it could go right under the back of that television. Okay. Last 8-bit story that I want to touch on, because it's an awesome one, and one of the guys is still alive, and I hope to God to get to talk to him sometime soon about this, is Joe DeCure. Joe was a worker for Atari, an engineer or a designer for Atari, who worked on the Atari 800 400 series. And we do need to take a quick second to put a star next to the Atari 800, because it's going to, for the rest of the time that I'm here, be a complete pain in the ass. Basically, they managed to create the computer that passed the Class 1 TV rule with the Atari 800. DeCure claims that it ruined the machine. To exaggerate, he claims that it ruined the machine. It was detrimental to the computer. It had this 2mm aluminum casing around the inside of it. If you've ever seen the inside of an Atari 800, they're like a tank. And that basically
like a tank.
Shit.
Like a heat trip.
Yeah. And and the heat inside of that thing. Anyway, but it was essentially anathema to what the Apple II was, which was this thing that you could open up the hood and it had all of its beautiful expansion ports and its parallel buses and all of this. Well, Atari was hamstrung. The only way that you were getting a peripheral or an expansion into the 800 was going to be through the serial bus, the cartridge ports. And to cure, I mean, he tells a bunch of stories about it, but that one, what he tells it, he is certainly clear that he does not like what that did to the machine to compete in the marketplace going forward. And I have to argue he's right to a degree. The Apple II, there's nothing more magnificent than a completely honked up Apple II with a whole bunch of crap on it and individual applications. It's like, here's my soundboard that only works with 3 programs, but look at this one program, it works. It's like you could do an amazing amount of expansion on top of the Apple II, and that Atari 800 never got to enjoy that. Because it had to go in as a Class 1 TV device.
Apple II users were the Linux users of their days.
I honestly, if you had an Apple II in 1977, well, your parents had a really good job.
No shit. That was an expensive piece of kit.
Or you were something. I don't know.
Yeah, no. They were super luxury items, but it also explains the fact that it was a color computer as opposed to the TRS-80 and the Commodore PET that were just monochrome.
Now, I fear that we may have only hit the halfway point here because we do have to finish what the actual thing that happened, and we haven't actually even addressed the actual thing that happened.
We do need to get to that point. So we've established the current situation with the FCC regulations.
We've call that before. Sorry.
So so we know that they're testing all these devices. We know a lot of devices are having a hard time passing. We know that the home computer guys are trying to bypass it by excluding the RF modulator. We've got Atari jumping through hoops and sacrificing some of the features of their machine and the expandability of the machine in order to just pass this. And the 800 is coming out for Christmas of '79, together with the 400. And now, in the run-up, we've got the FCC, and we've covered this on the show, so everybody can go back and listen to the previous episodes. We've been humming and hawing about FCC regulation changes for the last 6 months. What are those changes?
Well,
Oh, wait, we need to go back. We forgot the CB radio.
Okay, so what happens is it goes back to, and I hate to go back, but in April of 1976. So we go through this really fast. This is where they dropped the regulation. And this is why I prefaced this earlier by saying that these things take years. And so essentially, everyone should have known this in 1976. In April, they come out with what they call Docket 20780. And this thing is huge, and it will last, maybe still going today. I don't know. It actually isn't. But it's a broad redefinition. It's a huge reclarification of all of this stuff around radio frequencies. And they make up some new categories. And basically, your computers are going to be under what are called unintentional radiators. Things that radiate but don't use the radiation, as opposed to an intentional radiator like a walkie-talkie, for instance, something that is actually to do it. They're even clear with what a computer is or what this electronic device that they're seeking, and they give it a frequency rate of 10,000 cycles per second. Now, I know it's a big number, but think about that for a second. That's actually ridiculously small for a computer.
That's true.
That's only 10 kilohertz for your vibration. So in essence, everything that is electronic is coming under the FCC's purview now. And for some reason, certain industries recognize that better than others. And I got to give a quick shout out here because I steal this idea from Alex Smith from They Create Worlds podcast. And he talks about this on a number of occasions where we talk about a video game industry way back in the 70s and 80s. And I think this is a smashing example of how you can see how what we call a video game industry didn't behave like an industry because they're not organized like an industry. And the conflict that's going to occur here between the real computer people and the video game people is an enormous chasm. And the video game people are basically going to pay for it because they're not really organized. They have no lobbying group. So, however, all of the computer people do. And it's what's known as the Computer and Business Equipment Manufacturers Association. That mouthful is shortened down to CBEMA. CBEMA. And they are a reasonably well-established and fairly powerful lobbying and trade association. They've been around since 1916. They've had a bunch of name changes, and in fact, they're around today, and they're known as the Information Technology Industry Council.
Oh,
and
okay.
So way back in the day, though, they sort of changed their name they started as the National Association of Office Appliance Manufacturers. So the office chair people are mad, but they've got some awesome clout. See, they've already had a report in with the FCC in 1975. They're already petitioning them and writing up comments to talk about where you get this difference between the commercial and the residential equipment, right? Yeah. The difference between the professional equipment and the home user stuff. And you were mentioning, I recall you were mentioning the other day about zoning laws and how that was helpful in terms of separating some of this equipment that we're going to have this stuff running in commercial properties or industrial properties. CBEMA was also there with the great answer that, hey, and these high-end machines, these Class A machines that we'll get to in a second, are also going to be run by experts who are going to be able to deal with interference problems as they occur. So, yeah. Right. And so all of this is going on, and I'm not sure who the video game people have lobbying for them right now, but it's basically Atari. And they're the ones that moved the video game to another location just recently. So and in fact, there's even a quote on 14 April 1976, when the day this docket is voted on, where they specifically finger video electronic games as a recent culprit and an example of a product that's going to mass proliferate and not be able to be managed by individual stoppages. It's not going to be able to scale. They foresee these video games, or as they put it, video electronic games, are going to be a real problem. And so they really start to go after it. Now, in this case, they finally recognize that this old 15 microvolt limit, lambda over 2 pi, has met its course. It's finally going to be retired for something more reasonable. They just don't know what yet. Normally, proposals like this are a lot more clearly defined, but this thing is so huge that it's almost like an open invitation to the industry to say, okay, bring in your comments and then we'll talk about it in the future, right? We'll meet again in a year. That's why these things take such a period of time. In fact, they're not even finished with comments until the end of the summer of 1976. And then they get a ton of stuff back. All this stuff from CBEMA and the American National Standard Institution, and places like General Telephone and Electric Service Corp show up, and General Electric, or the National Electric Manufacturers Association, or AT&T, but what you won't hear is Atari or Commodore or Tandy. they're not commenting at all on this at first for the first 6 or 7 months. Texas Instruments is there, though, because they're one of the semiconductor giants. And to their credit, actually, Texas Instruments might be the only company that's close to an entertainment company that's the adult in the room for what they request in terms of they want a new process of equipment authorization. They definitely speak out against this idea of having to type approve all of these different things and seek to put in some realistic time limits. So anyway, that docket drops and basically an explosion occurs in the electronics industry, but not really so much the video game industry, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, this will proceed as time goes on. I'm going to break in, if we're going to take this chronologically, because again, I'm trying to blast through this. I know we're going to be running very late. There's a story that Joe DeCure tells also that I need to point out that was apparently goes back to early 1978. DeCure has told this story a number of times, and it's usually prefaced with the caveat that it is completely true, which always gets my attention. So as the story goes, Joe and his engineer, or an engineer with whom he's working named Wade, are having this random meeting with a salesperson from Texas Instruments. And the guy from Texas Instruments is trying to sell him this device, which was like a fiber cable with a transmitter on one end and a receiver on the other. And staring at this device, Joe, inspired, apparently on the spot, conceives the idea of the Standalone Rf Modulator. So in other words, the modulator that you could plug into the back with that computer that you couldn't hook to the TV normally. And instead of doing all that modulation inside the box, it'll do it outside, and you connect it to the TV. And according to Joe DeCure, the TI salesman's eyes bulge out of his head, and he leaves sort of mysteriously. Now, we'll put a thumbtack in this, too, because you can imagine this is going to come back, and it's actually going to be the critical chasm point. As Joe will tell the story, there wasn't anything that Atari could do to hurt Texas Instruments worse than that, based on what Texas Instruments is then going to do. And it is strange because the story, I wish we had time, and we do not, to talk about the story of the Texas Instruments TI 99/4, not the 4A.
Yeah,
because
we've talked about it a little bit on the show, but yeah, we didn't go into the difference between the 4 and the 4A.
I may not have enough life left, but that thing is a deep mystery to me because, well, I'll explain why. Here's what happens in February of 1979. And by the way, we just crossed 3 years there, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. So all of this stuff is still going on in the background. There's still, they're reading reports, Sabima, ANSI, commentary is coming in, but they know that soon the FCC is going to come out with some kind of regulation on this in the near future. Just nobody knows exactly when. We should take a quick aside from this, by the way, and mention that 1979 was just on the cusp of an election year. 1980 was the election year, but we're going to get political shortly, so I'm prefacing it. The Carter administration has been in now since 1976, right? Yeah. Carter has placed his dude in charge of the FCC. Drawing a blank at the guy's name right now. Wiley, I think it is. Anyway, Wiley basically, once he comes into the role, and there's nothing untoward. Don't forget, we had just come out of the era of Nixon, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Richard Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford was president without having been elected. He also wasn't vice president. He had to come in for the guy who resigned as vice president.
Spiro Agnew.
Yeah, I know, Spiro Agnew. And if you rearrange the, it's actually cut that out. We're not going to talk about the Spiro Agnew anagram. But basically, when 76 hit, it was fairly obvious that Carter should win the election, provided that he didn't screw it up. For the past 3 years, it's been a very different Democratic government in terms of what's been going on, in terms of deregulation, in terms of re-regulation. It's a very reactionary kind of government. And it's also worried that they're not going to last, right? So all this is a way of saying there's a talk, and it comes from people in the industry who have said there's a feeling when you get to this point in 1979 that if the FCC doesn't do something about this, they're going to run out of time in their current format, in their current democratic constitution. The commission, by the way, is a 7-person commission, and there's always a 4-3 split amongst the political parties, or you can't have more than 4 on one political party. So right now it's controlled by Democrats, and the whispers in the hallways are this regulation needs to get out the door soon because it's going to take a couple of years, and we may well not be here in a couple of years.
Yeah.
Our kind may well be voted out of office in 1980. And spoiler alert, that happens.
And Reagan is not what you would call famous for heavy regulations.
And this is as well. No, it's as sane as this sounds, because I've spoken to people who were around at the time working in the industry, the few that I could find, and it does sound crazy, but there was this idea from a broadcaster point of view that what might happen was that if these regulations didn't go, that the next administration might do something crazy like just say, no, computers are good, let the market figure it out. And then they would truly be in a mess. So that was kind of the feeling behind it to justify their desire to push this. So anyway, 1979, February, Texas Instruments comes in and drops a grenade in the room. They file a petition for the FCC for a standalone RF modulator. And I'm not sure why no one thought of this before. Joe Kirschner did a few months back, right? But
yeah.
Now that's in front of the FCC, and for whatever reason, I don't know if it's exactly that TI is now getting involved in this. We've discussed this before, and there's been hints of it. We're not going to cover it too long here now, but everybody was expecting Texas Instruments to come in and clean up the floor with these yahoos that were making microcomputers.
Yeah, they were the 800-pound gorilla, shy of IBM, which at this point doesn't look like they're going to, although, well, come our December episode, we will start talking about IBM getting into the business.
Filthy IBM is already making people sign NDAs and not telling about it because they're already looking into making one now.
Exactly.
But anyway, at the time, so this is the point that TI has to make this public. And here's the worst part. 11 days later, they file a second petition. And in this case, they want a waiver to sell it. So not only do they want the rule to sell the RF modulator, but they also now want a waiver to sell it. Well, I can't tell you the full force of vitriol that came down upon them for that. And I really am not sure why. I think that it might be partly political because of all of the solicitation and all of the comments that went to the FCC. There were 3 letters in particular that may have caught their attention. 2 of them were from Michigan-based congressman and senator. And the third was from a gentleman by the name of Congressman Jim Wright. Now, Jim Wright at the time was the House Majority Leader. So he carried a considerable deal of clout and also happened to be in the District of Texas where Texas Instruments had their headquarters.
Okay. Totally unbiased person.
So you can wait when you're speaking to a person of a certain vintage and asking them their memories of that time, they may very well remember it as though this was seen as a political hit job. Again, I wish that I had more of this research. I feel like I only have a fraction of this because a lot of this documentation does exist. And one of these days I am getting my mitts on docket 20780 from the archives, but these letters are in there, the letters that were written and respond. I'm assuming. I could only hope. But the pressure is on at this point. So TI has basically pushed the FCC to do this. Everybody else in the industry feels the same way. And so basically at this point, the race is on. The FCC actually solicits 6 computers, 6 of the most popular PCs at the time, to test for themselves. And they find out that like 3 of them blow the Class A limits. 3 of them can't even pass the high end emissions limits, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so to make a long story even longer, obviously we get to this point where they're going to institute this new rule around computing devices, and everybody is coming in with comments, especially Atari. And here's where Atari takes umbrage with everybody else, because Atari, of course, has
a compliant machine.
A compliant computer on a Class 1 TV device. And Atari starts throwing everybody under the bus. They're like, well, listen, no, we've proven that you can, not only did we prove that you can build a compliant computer, but these computers are only going to get worse. So in all of these comments, there's sort of this hilarious narrative where Atari finds itself on the same side as places like the National Association of Broadcasters or the American, what is it called? The Association of Maximum Service Telecasters.
Oh, wow.
You don't even need to look up what the Association of Maximum Service Telecasters does. It's already there. And so Atari is siding with these guys hand over fist about how dangerous computers are and how, no, you need to have restrictions. And we should be Anyway, it got to the point that Atari, it's basically Atari against the industry, which is why I mentioned earlier about how you've got this really divided industry who doesn't have a lobbying group. They're basically after their own interests. And so when this report comes out, here's the final take on it. You already know that there's a Class A and Class B computer. Our favorite home video games are Class B, and it's it's about 3 times more restrictive than what the Class A stuff is. Okay?
Yeah.
The FCC specifically says, thanks to your history of previous interference, coin-operated arcade games will now be considered as Class B devices.
Ooh.
Whoa!
In your face.
We have your attention now, coin-operated manufacturers. And finally, one huge thing that they do though is that they stop the type approval and move to the process of certification, which means that certification being the easiest, where someone can fill out a form, submit it to the FCC. You wait about 10 days, you get your certificate back. You're then able to begin marketing your product. So and finally, last point, all this is going to be ready by July 1st, 1980.
Ooh, little late.
And it's also, right now, by the way, it's September of 79 when all of and this is where, and by the way, if you're wondering why, to bring it all back home, why the proverbial fan feces is flying everywhere in November, it's because basically October is when this report was fully available. They had voted on it in September. By the time November hits, everybody's in a panic.
And Christmas is gone.
Right?
Yeah.
And they said, and they're like, oh, and by the way, you guys realize this is for all computing devices, not just computers. Like, we're talking handheld electronics, calculators, digital watches, home appliances. You're in there too, unless you're regulated like those nice CB people.
Okay. And now, there was a distinction made in this regulation between business machines and home machines.
Yes, that's the Class A and Class B distinction.
That's the Class A and Class B. So the video games become basically the same as home machines. Now, does anybody try to get their computers regulated as a business computer?
Yeah, there are a few of them. They go on about that a little bit later on. It's kind of funny. One of the price lines that they talk about is $5,000, which seems extremely excessive, even in 1980. Well, I think the idea was that they were trying to work their head around the example of what happens when someone who does have access to a really functional electronic data processing machine brings it home. And they kind of hash out some of that, but it's fairly clear where their distinction is. It's between your personal microcomputer versus your larger installations, your business class machines. Don't forget that there's a reasonably large chasm here in these early 8-bit eras, right? Those 8-bit machines are very obviously just home machines. In order to get those 8-bit things up to working snuff as a business electronic data processing system, you would really need to spend that you would probably be spending that $5,000 just to get the stuff to get that going. So there's not that blur like there might be today. It's fairly clear that your Atari and that 800, that Commodore 64, that VIC-20, that TI 99 4A, those are those Class B computers. Even the ZX.
So does the 4A, which is launched in Christmas of 79, is that compliant with the new regulation?
No, it does. When did you say it launched?
Christmas of 79, it hits the market.
No, that's the 4.
Isn't that the 4? I thought it was the... Oh, that's just the 4. You're right. Sorry, my bad. The 4 is 79. Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
And that's what has me scratching my head, because to jump ahead in the story, what ends up happening is there's just 2 big break off from that rulemaking. One of them is for the standalone RF modulator, and the other is for TI's waiver. Well, I'll spoil the story a little bit. TI gets the waiver, but then they don't seem to do anything with it. And it might be because by the time that they get it, they're too big to turn the boat. They basically they got sunk. What they did was they made, I don't know, 20,000, 30,000 some machines, hit the compliance issue. It seems like, I don't even know. I can't find an example of where they failed FCC. Not that I should have all of the FCC fails, but there's this weird thing where they just knew they were sunk. So instead of trying compliance, they just went with the proposal to have the separate RF modulator. And by the time that they bought 20,000 TVs to go along with these TI 99.4s, it was too late. The TI 99.4 has, what was it, 3-hour podcast on why that thing was an amazing monstrosity of an internal failure. And it's a shame too, because frankly, I just love the thing to death. But anyway, yeah, so what comes out of this is that there's going to be new rules now. They're going to give a new standalone RF modulator. They're going to propose to allow a waiver to Texas Instruments in order to sell this RF modulator right away. And they're also finally going to bring that Class 1 TV device. Well, they're going to update those rules too, and they're going to call it now a TV interface device. Okay. So the reason, and we'll try and summarize this up quickly, wrapping these three things together. This is why this story gets so messy, because it actually sort of splinters into these different parts of the electronics industry. Like, don't forget, the toy manufacturers are under this right now. The coin-op manufacturers have just found out that they are going to be treated as Class B computers. I don't know if you ever walked into an 80s arcade with a transistor radio, but I can tell you those things dropped dead once they were in that system. Right? If you had a Walkman on at 82 and walked into an arcade, forget it. You were swamped in RF, right? So that's basically, so that everybody's at this point starts to freak out, and every step of the way, who's there to antagonize them but Atari? And anyway, so for instance, like with they want to make a new rule for the TV interface devices. They want to bring those in compliance with the new computer rules that they have. It would make sense, right? You're going to have something to plug into the TV. You're going to have the computer. Let's make them the same thing. No, not by Atari. Like Texas Instruments makes the argument, and Atari goes after them saying, well, look, right now, you've got this black market device called an RF modulator, or certainly a gray market device, and they're restricted. And now you've got TI basically saying that they just want to sell them in order to, like, they're like, how is that not going to increase the interference potential? Why should there be any sense? Oh, and also Atari says you should keep type approval. We really like that thing where you have to send in your, you should keep that as well. So anyway, this sort of thing goes on. Atari also sticks its head up again. I'm sorry, I'm turning this into an Atari bashing session, but in terms of that,
some things must be. So
I have to vent. I have to vent. Anyway, the new rules are about to come down. Apparently, at first, I mean, this was a shock to everybody because these rules were supposed to apply in July of 1980. They gave 9 months. They do a lot of hashing on the dates. There's a lot of debate back and forth about the dates, but the FCC comes down and says, look, you already had 9 months. We'll give you another 9 months. There's the 18 that you wanted. Well, everybody freaks out about that too, right? They're like, no, you can't do this. And some places are writing in saying, if we have to do this, we're shutting down. That's it. If you're going to make us do this by July 1980, we're closing up shop. Apple actually asked for a 6-month extension. Tandy asked for a 9-month extension. Control Data Corp asked for a 7-year extension, but that was but that's like, understand, in all of this isn't just Tandy and Apple. This is Ford Motor Company and AT&T and GE and everybody that makes anything that's apparently making a frequency higher than 10,000 hertz.
Well, yeah, because there was a huge amount of chips going into the car industry at this point. Yeah. We've talked about that on the show as well, that they're eating up about 50% of the domestic chip production in 79.
Exactly. Okay, so to try and bring conclusion to this, I got to tell you what Atari does. Atari fights like hell. Atari tries procedural arguments. They tried to bring up precedent from other cases. They actually had conjunction with Tandy at this point, who for some reason were working. They wanted a new proposal for rulemaking for personal computers. They tried to argue that back in that September meeting in 1979, when they did the vote for the docket, someone had provided a visual demonstration of computer-caused interference. Well, Atari claimed that gave a prejudicial effect on the whole thing.
Oh, Jesus.
They tried to argue that the fact that there was the TV interface device ruling was going on was also prejudicing this rulemaking outcome. And my favorite, which was that they tried to say that in April 1976, when the very first docket came out, personal computers didn't even exist.
What?
Yes, in writing. And oh my God, listen, the FCC goes up one side of them and down the other. They're talking about, they're citing the Altair 8800. They're citing the original Apple Byte magazine, 1976 computer fairs that are occurring. Like, understand, at the end of this is basically Tandy and Atari are now trying to fight the FCC using procedural stuff involving cases like, in my favorite, Portland Cement Association versus Rockall House, or the United States versus Nova Scotia Food Products Corp. Like, that's the level that they're down to in terms of, like, that's the procedural fight that Atari gets into with these guys.
And Atari really doesn't know when to just cut their losses.
I guess I don't really know. I'm building up. Anyway, they're in bed now with the Association of Maximum Service Telecasters, and they want to tighten the Class B rules, if nothing else. They still argue that stuff should be going back to type approval. And what was there was another good one here. No, that was about it on Atari's behalf. But yeah, it was a super bitter fight. And even it's funny because in its ruling, the FCC shoots all of this down. Ultimately, the side that they're going to come to rule on is the idea that they're trying to balance technological development with regulation. Too much regulation, too little technological development. And so they recognize that every step of the way. And it's funny because they even quote themselves. The FCC says staff experience with personal computers substantiates the fact that restricted computers are less expandable than ones that aren't. We've got an office full of Apple IIs. Anyway, at this point in the story, who comes to the party late but the toy manufacturers of America? We won't get into them, but by the way, every single electronic handheld, electronic quarterback, speak and spell, little professor, all of them are now supposed to be Class B devices. So after all of the screaming and fussing and feuding, and I believe this is in March of 1980 when they redecide this. It's about 3 or 4 months before the deadline is supposed to go in. They're like, okay, look, you're all whiny SOBs. We're going to change the dates now for you. Electronic games and PCs, the Class B stuff, you're now going to be due in January of 1981. That's your new date. Everybody else who's a computer, you have until October of 1981. And finally, if it's already in production, it can avoid compliance until October of 1983.
Oh.
And I'm curious because I'm kind of wondering, I haven't had an opportunity to look to see if somebody had maybe tried to push a product to market in September of 81 to see if they could enjoy some of those compliances, but it might be worth looking out for because that becomes the before after cutoff date. So for our beloved PCs, it's January of 1981 is that date. Now, something that we got to tell you about this that I did avoid because we're running long is that these rules are way more lenient. These rules are significantly more lenient than what the old rules were, or even for the Class 1 TV devices. Well, the Class 1 TV devices were actually worse because they were borrowed from the oldest rules and then had more rules thrown onto them. But these ones, I can't, it's hard to come up with a number on it or a way to visualize it because it's a complex formula, but it's not, it's only a slight exaggeration to suggest that building an electronic device under these new rules becomes an order of magnitude easier. And so there has to be a drive, and I think we see it because I mean, the correlation causation maybe, but certainly there's a thrush of computers that we're able to build starting January of 1981. And part of that might be because the leniency around that is enormous in comparison to what it used to be before, right?
Yeah,
makes sense.
So
yeah, so we get the rush that will be led by things like the Commodore 64 and so forth. And that's all going to be because of this relaxation of the regulations.
Exactly. And the FCC comes out and tells the Association of Maximum Service Telecasters and Atari Incorporated, you know, just because you can build a computer that meets those standards doesn't mean you should. And so, no, Atari, you made some lovely arguments. It took a long time to go through them, but no, Atari. And so Atari does what any good civil corporation would do.
Start suing other people.
They sue their ass off. That's right. They take them to court. Independent. Now, you might be able to tell me this, and maybe we don't really even have time to go over this. We are trying to wrap, but I know that this thing ends up in appellate court. It ends up at the U.S. Court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit.
Okay.
I don't know if that means that they had a lower court judgment, or if you start at the Court of Appeals when you're fighting a regulator.
No, you never start at a Court of Appeals. If you're fighting a regulator, typically what's going to happen is that there will be, let's call it, it's like a regulatory court, administrative court. And so they will have their own internal proceedings, and you do have, even with an administrative body, you do have a right to a trial as such. It's not going to be a full-blown court trial, but there's going to be rules and regulations and so on and so forth. Now, if you do want to appeal the judgment of that administrative court, that is when you end up in an appeals court.
Well, look who's made a lawyer money. Atari Incorporated. We got money for an appeal. Throw that thing in there. Well,
yeah, Warner's got nothing else to do, and the last thing they want to do is end up with a lesser chunk of this very lucrative pie.
Buddy, we just released Space Invaders for the VCS. There's cocaine money forever. Oh, anyway, yeah. So they took him to court. I think we'll get together someday and go through this on Pacer. But what I think happened was they got shut down by the lower court, hit appeals, and appeals basically looked at it and said, "Aren't you still in a regulatory thing here?" And kind of asked them to go back and not be such dicks. Well, the court, no, there's a stay. I'm not going to bother digging it up here, but there's a stay at some point where the court was basically like, look, we'll give you 3 months and then come back. And if you can't, if you're still on the petition and everything with the FCC, then we'll decide. But honestly, I think Atari knew that the lower court shot them down in much. I'm only reading the FCC's interpretation of the Atari legal argument, so that's totally biased. Yeah. But boy, there doesn't seem like there was a lot of meat to hang on a bone there to take to an appeals court. I don't listen. I saw Matlock in a bar last night, and the sound was off. And so I have a pretty good gist of this kind of thing.
Let me put it this way. It doesn't sound like there would be a lot for them to argue here unless they could make an argument that there was a fundamental danger being posed by this regulation and a dereliction of duty by the administrative body in their exercise of their functions. I just don't see that happening here.
I bet you that's exactly what I find the day that I get my hands on that court docket. that will be the very argument that they use. All right. Yeah. So anyway, to sum up, the toy manufacturers come in and start begging the FCC not to make their precious handhelds part of the compliancy. By the end of 1980, you could well imagine there is a steady flow of requests for extension, exemption, waiver of all kind. But at the end of 1980 was maybe the best one, and that was a petition to stay for the date for the coin-op certification. Because don't forget now, the coin-op people are in the same boat as everybody else. They're going to be due on January 1st, 1981, and this is where, and again, I'm going back to Alex's how the video game industry was not a video game industry. This is not how the industry should behave. But nothing is going to bring an industry together like the threat of government regulation. And oh my God, is everybody on the same page all of a sudden in the coin-op field? You've got, check this out, Atari, Sega, Bally, Stern, Williams, Centauri, Taito, Gottlieb, Cinematronics, and Game Plan Incorporated.
Never heard of Game Plan. But...
no, I know, me neither. Where were you guys a year ago? What, did you not read the thing about the 10,000 cycles per second and the thing? No, you guys didn't read that. No, apparently they didn't. So they all file a joint comment. Basically saying that, listen, there's I don't know who I think I've got most of them there under the list, but they claim for 95% of the coin-op industry. And they're all basically saying, look, we're going to be on our best behavior here. Williams suggested that the coin-op should be completely exempt from this, that this is stupid. Stern asked to have the date moved until like next October. Sega petitioned to have this stayed until at least Atari's court proceeding was resolved, but it was about the same time that the court pushed it back to the FCC. And Atari's making the same case as everybody else that, listen, if you do this to us, economic hardship, blah, 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 we're going to lose money. And for some reason, Texas Instruments also sticks its nose in there, probably a little shot across the bow to piss Atari off. Like, man, like, this better not stop that Class B thing. But so all of the industry players of the coin-op industry are there to petition for this stay until October of 81. They just want the 6-month stay. They don't want to have it in January. Yeah. So skipping ahead, the handhelds finally get clearance. They play nicely, by the way, and it's a great example of where the Toy Manufacturers Association of America, who worked with Mattel and Milton Bradley and even the American Maximum Service Telecasters, were all played together and sent, their specs to the FCC, test equipment, and showed them that, no, this is not a potential interference threat. Of course, Atari and TI also stuck their nose in that petition as well. But in the end, the FCC agreed with the toy manufacturers in that the little handheld devices like your Merlin would not actually like sink a fleet of ships or something. They were allowed. Right. But, okay, stand by here. I just want to wrap up I want to get to this final part about the coin ops. The coin op people come back again. And they want anyway. They're asking for this process amongst the coin op players is going on. Atari and Williams have actually filed at this point another petition to change that from Class B back to Class A. So like, okay, well, we can't do anything else. But if we ask for a new rule to do this? So they get their new rule and they ask for the change of classes. They want to be verified instead of certified. And they agree that they put out their case. They say, look, these games are huge. They're meant to be operated in commercial spaces. Williams makes the argument that, there is no usual harm to the industry in this case. These are isolated instances. And most important of all, Atari have been good boys and girls and have been working really hard with the Oregon and Nevada State Police. They've gone out and they've gone and they've checked all the games that they had, and they've done tests with the police, and they want the FCC to know. And they even brought a memo of support from the Oregon State Police saying that they did all this good work, they've done the time, and now they would like to be in the good graces of the FCC again. They also made the case that no case of interference involving coin-op games had been recorded since 1977. And to that, they credit the microprocessor.
Oh.
Yeah. What? Wait, do you really? Oh, yeah. They on multiple occasions. It's not even just a misprint. They claim it gives them significantly reduced emission levels. Now, listen, on a huge PCB board, there's maybe we could maybe make that case, right? But it's very strange to hear these people going, no, it's this new microprocessor. That's why you haven't seen any problems since 1977. So you should let us back in your good graces, right? Right. So this is just on the cusp of when they're supposed to come into compliance in 1981. Now, guess what happened?
Uh-huh.
No, I'm dropping the bomb now. God damn it, Atari! So the FCC goes out and starts looking for problems. And they find them. Lots of them. They find no fewer than 6 cases that they can cite involving coin-operated games that involve radio interference. They've got games that are interrupting the U.S. Border Patrol. They've got an amateur radio station that was interrupted by a video game in a roller skating rink. There's a couple more involving bars and emergency services like police and ambulances. And there's, I mean, maybe they're reaching, but there was also this other one where there was an arcade next to a TV shop in a mall, which that just seems like bad planning, but they brought it up. What? And here's the best part of all was the case of Elwood City, Pennsylvania, where a public transport service would experience some radio interference along 2 points of its single route. There was the Oak Grove Inn and the Keystone Bar. And so the FCC went to do some investigation, and of course, with a little triangulation and a little head scratching, they come out with 2 culprits: Atari asteroids.
Oh.
Yes. So that's the punchline. And that, by the way, was in April of 1981.
No.
Yes.
Yeah, that'll do it.
In December of that year, Sega, Bally, Stern, and yes, Atari file a joint motion for the reopening of a comment period because they have some explaining to do.
And they're really desperate, aren't they?
They're very sorry about asteroids. We didn't know. Just please don't make us be personal computers. To me, this is so awesome because this was like on the precipice of like basically, well, to be fair, in most of our story here, it's hard to, we'll talk about the long-term effects real briefly, but everything's going off a cliff soon anyway. And so it is difficult to tell whether it would be caused by regulations or whatever, but man, the FCC could have come down hard on coin-operated games. Honestly, I'm not sure why they didn't. Atari then had to bust ass afterwards and go chase all of those compliance cases, which they did. And they even use, they use an ironic, not as bad as you think defense, where they point out that there was actually 20 or 30 other cases of interference that they've been working with the last couple of years, or that they knew of like 20 or 30 cases throughout the industry that the FCC didn't even know about. And we've been busy fixing that stuff. So that should be fine. But to the point, I think the reason ultimately that they, there's a couple reasons I think that the FCC did. And one is that out of all of the interference cases that are experienced, ultimately, the number, even though it seems big and is anecdotally laughable to us, is still ultimately kind of small. And the other reason is, and I found this out too, there's a quote here. It says, the Commission's Authorization and Standards Division of the Office of Science and Technology will be requesting manufacturers to ship a sample game to the FCC laboratory in Columbia, Maryland for spot checking. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm going to go to my grave imagining that there's this giant, amazing retro arcade that still sits under a light in Columbia, Maryland. Because, like, basically, they're like, okay, well, I'll tell you what. You guys can be Class A devices with verification, but we're going to need you to send a game. Each of those games should come to our lab for testing. That's what you should do. And they did. They literally, like, apparently for at least a year, everything from like 81, 82 gets shipped to a lab in Columbia.
Nice.
Where are these? Anyway, they said, but because you're still jerks, and Atari, we're going to set your date to December of 1982. You got to get yours. You got to get yours boosted up. Anyway, that takes care of the overarching fallout of what happened from that 1979. You can go on about it at even great. Oh, I guess the one last thing is that they changed the Class 1 TV device to the TV interface device so that it matches the computer. And I forget the dates, like we're into 1983 by the time that occurs. So there is some crossover in terms of what had a benefit over the other. I don't know if it came to any effect because those 6-month windows are not possible to move in as a manufacturer. But there is some play there buried in those dates where companies had a chance to move for or against the regulations depending on what they wanted.
Okay. And so how long are these
No
regulations
questions. There are no,
effect?
I will take no questions.
No, so is the 79 regulation still the law of the land?
Oh my God, no, long gone.
Okay, how long does it last till?
Is it, maybe someone could look it up for me because my computer just timed itself out. The communication, it's 86 or 89 is when a new that's when a new Communications Act is written.
Okay. Gotcha.
And at that point, I think it's like, maybe, no, 94. Communications Act of 94. Am I getting crazy? I'm now punch drunk from 2.5 hours, but it's in that vicinity when that new Communications Act comes out. It takes from a lot of it. I haven't read it all, but I get the sense of, okay, I see what you did. Because also it's the kind of where, yeah, it's, you know, it's 60 years later. There's a whole bunch of new technologies. They basically rewrite that whole thing.
Yeah, you were right. 94.
Yeah, there we go. I'm not as burnt out as I thought.
Okay, cool. So that means that we still have a couple of years before we have to bring you back on here to explain the next one, right?
I may keep going for just a couple of years.
I didn't mean not on this Skype call, right?
I didn't want to feel like at the end I was chintzing out and begging for a sequel. But the more I researched this, the more I realized this thing just never ends.
Of course not. It's
just
government regulation of an industry.
How stupid was I to look for closure? The best I could do was find like the dates at which the different type of video game had to come to compliance and the date that they could get away with some sneaky stuff. Mm-hmm. But for what it's worth, by the way, after this, the FCC turns nasty. They've got some great stories. Once the regulation is in full play, in 1984, they established what they call the sampling branch. And that's where they start going after places because they start testing machines and finding them out. They had like CB radio seizures at start, and they leveled like a huge fine against a popular cordless phone manufacturer. And at one point, they seized $1 million worth of computer equipment in 84 from Sequa Computer Corporation. Like that's a grab. And it gets worse. In spring of 86, FCC agents show up at the Comdex show, which is a trade show. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They are surveying the attendees and whatnot. And shortly after the show, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of fines start showing up. $250,000 worth of fines start showing up in people's mailboxes that were based on the people that were at the Comdex show. And to do themselves no favors whatsoever, that fall, the FCC shows up again, this time accompanied by U.S. federal agents, where they start seizing product directly off the showroom floor.
Oh, my God.
The way to win friends and influence the industry, I guess. But as you can see, throughout this, there's, you know, the poor video game industry that exists prior to that first crash. What little of it exists after that first crash is powerless in relation to what, you know, the control data corporations and the General Electrics and the American Telephone and Telegraphs have from 60 years of experience dealing with lobbying and government regulation and all that garbage.
Sounds like lessons were learned and probably forgotten later on. Okay. Hey.
Now you can cut all this down to 45 minutes, right?
Yeah, of course.
Perfect.
Of course.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
An hour 45 thank minutes. God we don't have to care about that.
I don't know what listeners have listened to up to this point, but if for some reason you've listened this long and I said something wrong and you want to publicly tear a strip off of me, please. It's QuarterPast38 on Twitter, and I'll see you there.
Exactly. Hey, Dale, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing both your knowledge on the subject with us as well as your time. I know you're dealing with a blizzard right now or some other ungodly event that is a regular occurrence for you.
I'm in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. You're in Canada. And we will stay in touch. And the next time that we need some FCC knowledge dumped on us, we will remember to call you.
Oh my God, I feel bad that you brought it up in the first place, but you can imagine what it did to me after having, and I appreciate the opportunity because largely it was a subject that I had kind of touched on and kept notes on. And after digging through this to hear somebody else go, and now we're talking about the Federal Communications Commission. I was like, what? No one cares about that crap. What are you talking about? So I was all over that, but it was a great opportunity for me because basically I have 1,000 pages of notes that I would love to be able to compress into something that I can share with the other people who have done so much of that kind of work for me in advance. Whether or not they'll listen to 2.5 hours of this, I don't know. But it was a good start to be able to take that narrative and compress it. So
worst case scenario, this will be wonderful ambient sound to fall asleep to.
Be like, listen, I want you to listen to my thing, but we sped it up to 4 times the speed. You can get it in half an hour. Okay, so Peter, the comprehension quiz will be mailed to you next Tuesday.
Wonderful.
I wish you the best of luck.
Oh yeah.
And
I'm nervous.
Remember, 15 microvolts, lambda over 2 pi.
Yeah, this is like going into my brain right now.
I'm gonna go get it tattooed.
Go for it. Okay, man. Talk to you later.
Thanks, guys.
Have fun.
Have fun. Bye.
Bye.
Peace.